The room was stifling, though the thermostat insisted it was a comfortable 72 degrees. Peter Cross sat at his desk, hunched over his laptop. The glow of the screen highlighted the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. It wasn't the heat that made him uncomfortable. It was something he couldn't quite put into words, a gnawing sensation, as though the air itself was thicker, heavier, filled with something unseen. It had started a week ago. First, the headaches, sharp pulsing stabs at his temples that came and went like lightning strikes. Then the smells. The damp mildew in his apartment walls became unbearable, filling his nostrils with a sour, suffocating stench. Even now, as he breathed in deeply, he caught a metallic tang in the air that shouldn't have been there. Blood? No, not quite. Something sharper, colder. Peter sighed and rubbed his temples. He was an investigative journalist, used to digging into stories that didn't want to be found, but this time he had no leads, no sources to question. All he had were his own growing symptoms, which felt like they were dragging him toward an unseen abyss. He reached for his coffee mug but froze as his fingers brushed it. The heat of the ceramic was sharper than it should have been, like a burn waiting to happen. Startled, he pulled his hand back and stared at his palm. His skin was unmarked, yet the sensation lingered, a phantom singe. The sound of breaking glass snapped him out of his thoughts. He leapt to his feet, his heart pounding, and rushed to the kitchen. There, his neighbor Clara stood in the shared hallway between their apartments, clutching a broken mug. Her hands trembled as she picked up the shards, and Peter noticed streaks of red dripping onto the floor. "Jesus, Clara, are you okay?" he asked, stepping forward. She looked up, startled. Her eyes were wide, dilated, her pupils oddly misshapen, oval, almost feline. "It slipped," she whispered. I didn't mean to." Her voice trailed off, and her gaze darted to her hands. Peter followed her line of sight and felt a cold dread settle over him. Her fingertips were bleeding, but not like a normal wound. The blood was viscous, darker, shimmering faintly under the fluorescent light. "Clara," he said cautiously, "you need to get that looked at." She shook her head violently, cradling her hands to her chest. It's fine. It happens sometimes." "Sometimes?" Peter's journalist instincts kicked in, pushing down the nausea roiling in his gut. "What do you mean, sometimes?" Clara took a step back, her bare feet crunching on the glass. "Forget it, Peter. Just forget it." Without another word, she turned and disappeared into her apartment, slamming the door behind her. Peter stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark streaks of blood on the floor. The metallic tang in the air was stronger now, almost suffocating. It wasn't just him. Something was happening to the people around him. That night, Peter couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's blood, its shimmer like molten metal under the light. His own body felt foreign, his senses sharper and more attuned to the slightest noise. The hum of the refrigerator, once a dull background murmur, now felt like a jet engine roaring in his ears. By dawn, he couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. The first thread unraveled when he dug into the forums. Online conspiracy boards were usually a cesspool of nonsense, but one particular thread caught his eye. Cluster effect. Are you experiencing symptoms? The post was by someone named Crenarch, who described symptoms eerily similar to Peter's own. Heightened senses, strange bodily reactions, and an unshakable feeling of unease. Peter scrolled through the comments, his unease growing with each reply. My skin feels like it's crawling, but there's nothing there. I can't even wear clothes sometimes without screaming. Smells are unbearable. My wife thinks I'm crazy because I keep saying the air smells like ammonia. It started after the flash. You know, that green light. Did anyone else see it? The flash. Peter's hand froze over his keyboard. He hadn't thought about it in days, but now it came rushing back. A brilliant green light that had streaked across the night sky 2 weeks ago. He'd been out walking at the time, watching the stars, when the light flared overhead. It was beautiful, he remembered. Otherworldly. But then it vanished as quickly as it came, leaving nothing but a faint glow on the horizon. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. The flash couldn't have caused this, could it? But the timing was too coincidental. And the symptoms people described, the changes, they were too specific, too consistent across posts, to dismiss as mass hysteria. By the next day, Peter started noticing other things. His reflection in the mirror was wrong, though he couldn't pinpoint why. His eyes seemed darker, the whites tinged faintly gray. His veins stood out more against his skin, faintly luminescent in the dim light of his bathroom. When he pressed his fingertips to his wrist, his pulse felt faster than usual and stronger, almost unnatural. Peter began keeping notes, tracking every change in his body. He measured his pulse, his body temperature, even his reaction times. All were subtly altered, higher, faster, sharper. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, disjointed visions of places he'd never been, structures that pulsed with light and breathed like living organisms. The final straw came when Anthony, his best friend, confronted him at work. They had always been close, bonded over years of shared stories and mutual cynicism. But today, Anthony seemed different. You're changing, Anthony said quietly, cornering Peter in the break room. His voice was low, his eyes shadowed. You've noticed it, haven't you? Peter's stomach turned. What are you talking about? Anthony leaned in closer, his breath hot against Peter's ear. It's happening to all of us, some faster than others, but you can't stop it. Peter's heart pounded in his chest. What do you mean? How do you know? Anthony straightened, a strange smile playing on his lips. Because I've been watching, and soon you'll understand. Without another word, Anthony walked away, leaving Peter frozen in place, a cold dread creeping up his spine. Something was terribly wrong, and Peter knew he was running out of time to figure out what. The government facility loomed in the distance, a gray monolith nestled within the barren hills. Its sharp edges and glaring floodlights gave it an air of menace, as if the very building rejected the world around it. Peter parked his car at the base of the hill, well outside the security perimeter, and slipped into the shadows. He'd bribed a contact to get the blueprints of the facility. But even with the map etched in his mind, a pit of dread churned in his stomach. It had taken weeks to trace the origins of the cluster effect. Cryptic online whispers, a coded email from an anonymous source, and a heavily redacted government document led him here. Gentech Laboratories, a privately contracted research hub with a reputation for secrecy. If anyone had answers about the changes, it would be them. The air inside the facility was stale, tinged with the sharp tang of antiseptic and something more metallic. Peter crept through the sterile hallways, ducking behind carts of equipment and unused gurneys. Every so often, he passed through a security checkpoint, the hum of surveillance cameras a constant reminder of how little time he had. His goal was clear: Room 42. C. The documents hinted it held the data he was after, something called Project Genesis. But as he moved deeper into the building, the unsettling atmosphere pressed down on him. The halls were silent, save for the occasional faint hum of machinery, but it was a living silence, the kind that felt watchful. Finally, he reached the door. A keypad glowed faintly beside it, and Peter quickly entered the stolen passcode. With a soft hiss, the door slid open. He stepped inside, and his breath caught in his throat. The room was a laboratory, but it resembled something out of a nightmare. The centerpiece was a massive tank of viscous green fluid, its surface broken by wires and tubes snaking into the walls. Floating within the tank was a human figure. At least, it had once been human. Its skin was translucent, veins and organs glowing faintly in the sickly light, arms extended into long branching tendrils, and its mouth was a twisted ruin of jagged teeth. As Peter approached, its eyes snapped open, locking onto him with a cold, alien intelligence. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. "Subject 17, came a voice from the speakers overhead, startling him. "Unstable transformation. Results inconclusive." Peter spun, searching for the source of the voice, but the room was empty. It was a recording, triggered by his presence. He moved to a terminal and plugged in the drive he'd brought. Files blinked to life on the screen, each labeled with cryptic project names. Genesis, Stellar Convergence, Signal Protocol. He opened the first file. The documents laid everything bare. The cluster effect wasn't a natural phenomenon. 2 weeks ago, a satellite stationed near the asteroid belt detected a massive burst of energy from deep space. It was a signal, a frequency unlike anything recorded before. The satellite transmitted the signal back to Earth, where Gentech scientists decoded it, or at least tried to. The signal wasn't just a message, it was a blueprint. Encoded within its frequencies were instructions, a sequence of changes meant to rewrite DNA. The experiments began in secret. Volunteers were exposed to the signal, their DNA gradually restructured. At first, the changes were promising. Enhanced senses, rapid healing, increased strength. But the transformations didn't stop. Bodies warped, minds fractured, and subjects either succumbed to madness or became something other. Peter's stomach churned as he read further. The experiments weren't limited to volunteers. Civilians were being exposed to the signal remotely, through subtle broadcasts embedded in communication networks. Cluster effect hotspots, the report called them. Cities, neighborhoods, even rural towns were being used as unknowing test sites. The green flash he'd seen 2 weeks ago was no random celestial event. It was the moment the signal had been deployed worldwide. He nearly dropped the laptop when a loud clang echoed from the hallway. Someone, or something, was coming. Panicked, Peter yanked the drive from the terminal and stuffed it into his pocket. He scanned the room for an exit and spotted a vent panel near the floor. He pried it open and crawled inside, his heart pounding in his ears. From within the narrow confines of the vent, he watched as 2 figures entered the lab. They weren't guards. Their movements were jerky, almost insect-like, their limbs bending in unnatural angles. Their faces were pale, their skins stretched tight over prominent veins that pulsed faintly with blue light. "Progressing," one of them rasped, its voice garbled and uneven. "The hive grows." Peter covered his mouth to stifle a gasp. He'd seen enough. Whatever was happening to the people exposed to the signal, it wasn't just biological. There was a unity, a purpose, behind their transformation. Peter slipped out of the vent system and into another part of the facility. He couldn't leave yet. There was one more thing he needed to find. If the documents hinted at the signal's origin, then he needed to confirm it. After several harrowing minutes of dodging patrols and avoiding security cameras, he found his way into the central server room. The terminal here wasn't locked, and within moments he found what he was looking for: the source of the signal. A location marked only as Site Alpha, deep in the wilderness, where the energy burst had first been detected. Peter downloaded the coordinates and bolted, his every instinct screaming at him to leave before he became another twisted experiment. Back in the safety of his car, Peter stared at the drive in his hand. The implications of what he'd discovered were staggering. The changes weren't random. They were deliberate. Someone, or something, was altering humanity on a genetic level, preparing them for... what? He thought of Subject 17, its glowing eyes full of cold malice. He thought of the misshapen guards, their voices dripping with hive-like unity. He thought of himself. The faint shimmer in his veins seemed brighter in the dim light of the car. He clenched his fists, willing the changes to stop, but deep down he knew the truth. He was part of this, whether he wanted to be or not, and the clock was ticking. Continuation of the story. Watch it tomorrow.